The growth of industry in America and the rise of railroads. It's really hard to overstate the importance of railroads in America becoming an industrial might in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The railroads have been around for a long time. They had replaced canals and steamboats as the main way to get people and goods from one point to another. Canals were around for a while, and at the time, canals in the 1820s and 30s, they were considered the state-of-the-art way of transporting heavy things and lots of people, but you had to connect existing waterways or dig really long canals. It was very, very labor-intensive. And the creation of the national road as well and other smaller roads were important, but the country was always looking for a better way of doing things. So when the railroads came along and the steam locomotive, this too required a tremendous amount of physical labor to get the tracks made and put down on the ground and clear the land and make it level and safe, but the nation was up for it. And this wasn't something that was done by the government, mostly private industry, sometimes in conjunction with the government. So in the 1860s, under President Lincoln and then other leaders of the nation and leaders of railroad industries, they decided to create a railroad system that linked one side of the country to the other. And we refer to that as the Transcontinental, meaning across the continent. And so you may have seen this photo before, a famous image of the two railroad lines, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific railroads coming together. They'd worked from opposite sides of the country. One started in Nebraska, the other started in California, and they worked to try to meet in the middle. And they were getting paid by the government to do this. And they knew that it would make the companies rich and it would also benefit the nation. So in 1869, these two sides, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads, they were to meet up and connect in Utah. So you can see from this particular map some of the existing earlier railroad lines that were on the eastern part of the United States, but nothing really ran all the way to California. And so this new Transcontinental Railroad made it possible to go from, say, New York City all the way to Sacramento via railroad line. It might take a few weeks, but it certainly wouldn't take months and months, and it wouldn't be as dangerous as if you were trying to get there on a covered wagon. So this really will change America because now you can get goods and people across the country. And even though this is the first Transcontinental Railroad, there will be many more offshoots of this, branches, if you will, that will go and change America in terms of the way people and goods are transported and where factories are located. Just the ripples of this really are hard to really fully get your head around because it will change America so much. It is one of the big indicators and big leading events of America's rise as an industrial power. It should be noted, though, someone's got to build these tracks. It's not an easy task. They used a variety of men to do it. The companies hired people to cut down the trees, level the land, put down the actual railroad tracks and the railroad ties. It was extremely, extremely brutal work, and a good chunk of this work would be done by Chinese immigrants. So some of these images you see here are actual workers who were brought over or who are already in the United States and were brought to the area where they were building the tracks, willing to work and take the risk. Oftentimes it was beyond just hard work. It was very dangerous. Sometimes, involved blasting through mountains, and Chinese immigrants would many times get in baskets, light dynamite in the rock, and push away from the rock with their legs for the explosion, and then, swinging back towards the explosion as the explosion died down. So many people were hurt or killed, but the railroad was completed in 1869, and this will change America. The Transcontinental Railroad is the beginning of really the modern railroad era. And again, railroads are going to replace the canals, and railroads will reign supreme for a while, but of course, over time, the highway system with trucks and planes, airplanes will come alongside the railroads. Even today, many things that you use and touch in your normal life, products, are on the rail system at some point. So it's still a vital part of American industry and American way of life. Some famous people that you might have heard of who are connected with the early railroad days, especially when it goes really national. Probably the most famous railroad baron of them all would be Cornelius Vanderbilt, as in Vanderbilt University in Nashville. He is what we would call a railroad baron. He made so much money. It's really hard for us to understand how wealthy he would be. He would be the Jeff Bezos or the Bill Gates of his time, connecting the New York Railroad through the Great Lakes region. And you can kind of see from the photo of his New York home, over the top wealthy based on, and he made his wealth on the railroad industry. But railroads in general will stimulate the economy, all aspects of the economy. It will encourage factories to be moved now to out west or in the Midwest, and goods can be transported on these new railroad lines that are going to be built. And there'll be, more than just that one transcontinental railroad. As the railroad barons and companies get together and realize that maybe we should all be on the same system here, they develop a standard gauge for the railroad, meaning that the width of the track would be the same no matter what railroad you're on. And they formulate a number, and they basically come up with it, from one railroad track to the other, it will be about 4 feet, 8.5 inches. So now that railroad cars can run on all tracks, even if a particular railroad line is owned by someone else. And this standardizing of all the railroad tracks at the same size will mean that the country will be able to grow even faster, and goods and services and people will be able to grow. So men like Vanderbilt and others will take this idea of kind of being more regional, at least at first, these railroads. Now it's across the country and will be like arteries that connect to all parts of the nation. But it won't be just George Vanderbilt who gets wealthy off of this. Others will invent things connected to railroads, which will also stimulate the economy and change America. For example, George Pullman is given credit for inventing a certain type of car that is pulled behind a steam locomotive. So, you can pull train cars that carry freight like coal or lumber, products, but you can also pull people. And so these long trips that might take weeks to go from New York to California, you needed a ride in comfort, you needed some place to sleep. So George Pullman creates the Pullman car, or the sleeping car, and we'll be talking about that a lot more in the class a little bit later on. But here's an example of kind of the luxurious way you could travel now. You could travel and sleep overnight as the train keeps moving, never stops, and you arrive at your destination. And it's to many Americans, this is the best way you could ever possibly travel. They can't even imagine a better way of traveling than the railroads. And of course, it was built upon the backs of, those who would labor and build the track and lay the track. But the railroads are going to have an impact all through the country, right? It will ripple. So if you're going to lay railroad tracks across the country, you're going to need steel. And so this is going to lead to a growth in the steel industry. So people like Andrew Carnegie will become super wealthy because of the steel that's being used and needed to grow America, build the buildings, build the tracks, everything that's going to radiate from the railroad. And if you think about the Pittsburgh Steelers, that's a place where steel was made. A lot of iron is found in Pennsylvania. You can turn that into steel by kind of turning it into lava and adding some carbon and things, and you get a stronger metal that would be used for train tracks and buildings. And these new skyscrapers are going to be built now that we have a strong skeleton that can go higher and safer. So it's really going to change everything about America. So not only will the steel industry grow, but now you can transport a lot more timber, more easily across greater distances using railroads, and it will lead to just a boom in America and an increase in America's might. So if I were to look at a modern map of the railroads today, it really should remind you of, like, say, arteries, maybe in your leg or arm or out throughout your body. It's transporting goods and people all around. Even today, not many people, though, might take the railroad as a form of transportation. Goods, steel, lumber, all those things are still riding on a railroad. As you watch this video, trains are pulling things all over the country, powered mostly by diesel today, diesel engines, not so much coal. But you can also tell from this there are some bigger arteries that are thicker and get more use, There are some areas of the country that have a higher concentration, but really no part of the country is too far away from a major railroad line. One other side note you should remember about railroads, not only is it going to lead to the industrialization of America during this last part of the 19th century, but it's also going to force us to think about time zones. We had never had to deal with that because it was really impossible for anyone to travel from one part of the country to the next easily, and if you did, you certainly weren't keeping in contact with people in the other part. The railroad, in combination with telegraphs and eventually the telephone, will make it necessary for the country to adopt time zones so that you know what time you're at in relative time to other parts of the country. So without the railroads, who knows when we would have developed time zones, but they are instrumental in figuring out the big major time zones on the continental United States, of which there are 4. And even today, we operate on the system that was created back when the railroads were really coming of age in the late 1800s.